The topic of today's video is skull, which consists from the two parts. First is neurocranium, the bones which surround the brain and protect it, and facial bones or viscerocranial, which form the skeleton of the anterior aspect of the head and serve as skeleton of the nasal cavity, oral cavity, and orbit. Neurocranium consists of the two paired and unpaired bones. Two paired bones we have parietal and temporal. Parietal bone and temporal bones. These two bones are paired. Also we have unpaired, such as frontal, sphenoidal, and occipital bones. Os frontale, os sphenoidale, os occipitale. Also to the neurocranium belongs one small bone which calls ethmoidal bone. Yes, like this. There is ethmoidal bone. First bone, occipital bone. Occipital bone has 4 parts and 2 surfaces. Parts of the occipital bone. First part, squamous part, squama occipitalis. Lateral part, 2 lateral parts, pars lateralis. And basilar part, pars basilaris os occipitalis. All of them fuse to form the foramen magnum. There is foramen magnum. Surfaces of the occipital bone. Occipital bone has external and internal surface. Also has borders, has parietal border, also called as lambdoidal border, margo lambdoideus, margo mastoideus, which relate and corresponded to the mastoidal process of temporal bone. Also has jugular rim, on which we have the structures which later form the jugular foramen. Yes, also has angles, superior angle, angulus superioris occipitali, and lateral angle, or also called mastoidal angle of occipital bone. On the external surface of the occipital bone, we can find the 3 lines which are visible on this picture. First it is supreme nuchal line, linea nuchalis suprema. Below of it, visible and prominent superior nuchus line, that was suprema. This one is superior nuchus line, linea nuchalis superior. Yes, and the last one is linea nuchae or nuchal inferior line, linea nuchalis inferior. All of these 3 lines serve as a point of origin of different ligaments and groups of muscles, that if the muscles are large and work a lot, then these lines should be more prominent. Okay, and on the midline of all of them we have most prominent part of this surface, which call it external occipital protuberance or tuberculum occipitalis externa or protuberantia occipitalis externa, also called as inion, like craniometric point. Yes, also the point of attachment of several muscles. Directed downward from this point, from this protuberance, we have crest, which call it external occipital crest, crista occipitalis externa. Yes, all of these lines form the posterior surface of occipital bone. On the inferior of the occipital bone, you can see the condylar fossa, which continues to the condylar canal. Yes. Some arteries pass through it. Yes, there is condyle fossa condylus. Yes, that is condyle fossa. Next one is on the lateral part. You can see on the external surface. On the external surface of the lateral part, you can see the condylus of occipital bone. Yes, condylus occipital condyle, condylus occipitalis, which has epicondyles, which serve for attachment with first cervical vertebra. Yes, on just above of the condyles, you can see the foramen, which form as canal and leads into the cranial fossa and calls as hypoglossal canal, canalis nervi hypoglossalis. On internal surface of the squamous part, you can see the cruciate eminence on the midline. It is internal protuberance of occipital bone, which form the cruciate eminence of the eminentia cruciformis of the occipital bone, and like rays to different sides from all of the bones, from all of these sides, we have different structures. For example, above from this protuberance, we have groove for superior sagittal sinus, sulcus sinus sagittalis superior. By sides from this prominence, we have sulcus sinus transversus, groove from the transverse sinus, which is parietal. Yes. And directed downward from the eminence, which has name as internal occipital crest. Internal occipital crest. Yes, also these four structures separate the occipital bone onto this cruciate eminence, which separate internal surface of the occipital bone onto the four divisions. First division, it is cerebral fossas, parietal, the occipital lobe lay here, and cerebellar fossa, which also projected here. Okay. And last part of the occipital bone is internal of lateral part and basilar part. Lateral part internal has a fossa and incisura, or here as a notch, a jugular notch of occipital bone, which later joined together with petrous part of the temporal bone to form jugular foramen. Just before it, this large one is named as groove of sigmoidal sinus, sulcus sinus sigmoidae, and also it continues to the groove of the inferior petrous sinus on the side of the basilar part, yes, which also runs to the jugular notch. On the basilar part, you have on internal surface on the one structure which calls clivus, where is soft and smooth structure Yes, and brainstem project on it. On external surface of the basilar part, we have also only one structure which calls pharyngeal tuberculum pharyngeum, the muscles of the pharynx attached to this side. That is occipital bone. This next bone for this group is parietal bone, the favorite bone of the students, because this bone has only 4 angles, 4 borders, and 2 surfaces. Okay, go forward. Okay, the parietal bone is a flat bone of the skull, classified as a flat bone, which has external surface and internal surface. External is convex, internal is concave. Has 4 angles: sphenoidal, most prominent and sharp angle; anterior inferior angle; superior anterior angle, call it frontal angle, angulus frontalis, parietalis; posterior superior is occipital angle, angulus occipitalis; posterior inferior, call it mastoidal angle of parietal bone, to correspond with mastoidal process of temporal bone. Borders of the parietal bone also external and internal surface. Yes, borders: anterior, call it as frontal border, margo frontalis; superior border, call it sagittal border, margo sagittalis; posterior border, call it as occipital border; and inferior, call it as squamous border. Yes, squamous border of occipital bone. Yes, and structures which can you find on it? It is half of groove for superior sagittal sinus, some small amount of groove of sigmoidal sinus, yes, on internal surface, and grooves for the arteries, yes, for the medial meningeal artery and sulci arteriosi, which can be present like impressions on the internal surface. On external surface, you can see the tuberculum eminens, or parietal tubercle, or parietal eminence, or tuberosity, which is can be different in different people. Each person has unique type of this structure, like somebody has eminence and somebody has tubercle. Next one is just below the eminence is the superior temporal line. Yes, and below of it has as present is inferior temporal line. Just below of it we have formation of temporal fossa, some amount of the temporal fossa. Okay, that was the parietal bone. Next bone of the neurocranium is frontal bone. Frontal bone has 4 parts. 4 parts of the frontal bone. Yes, there is frontal bone. The normal position is like this. Yes, and 4 parts. First, squamous part. Next one is orbital part and nasal part. Yes. Surfaces. Squamous part has external surface and internal surface. Orbital part has external surface orbital part of orbital surface of orbital part, or external surface. Internal surface or cerebral part of orbital part. Yes, and last one is nasal border or nasal rim. Yes, this one. Nasal margin, margo nasalis. And borders, supraorbital margin, margo supraorbitalis, margo sphenoidalis, margo parietalis, parietal margin of the frontal bone. Yes, and some small amount on posterior aspect is continuation of sphenoidal border. Means this site is a place of relationship with other bones. On the external surface of squamous part of the frontal bone, we can see the two most prominent structures, which calls frontal eminences. Yes, frontal eminences, eminentia frontalis, which shall be also present, such as frontal tuberosity or frontal tubercle. Yes, because different persons say has different shape of the bone. Next one, supraorbital arch, superciliar arch, arcus superciliaris. Yes, and by sides of it, continuation of the temporal line. Yes, continuation of the temporal line. Yes, where the superior and inferior fused in one and continues to the supraciliar arch into the one process, which called zygomatic process of the frontal bone. Some part of the squamous part of the frontal bone, just below the temporal line, call it temporal surface of the frontal bone. On the internal surface of the frontal bone is superior sagittal sinus groove, and which continues to the crest. Yes, crest of the superior sagittal sinus. On the end of it, you can see the foramen here. Yes, there is foramen, which call it foramen cecum. Yes, here is foramen cecum. Yes, this one is foramen cecum, related with ethmoidal bone. Also on the orbital part, you can see the impressions, the rough structures here, which call it impressio digitalis, impressions of the fingers. On the orbital part of the frontal bone of the external surface, you can see the three structures. First, it is supraorbital notch, incisura supraorbitalis, or can be this result in individual having some azers, like in this case is supraorbital notch, or should be supraorbital foramen, or can be present a supraorbital canal. Yes, because some arteries and nerves pass through it. Also individual. Laterally from this fossa, laterally in this fossa, you can see the fossa of the lacrimal gland, fossa glandula lacrimalis. It's located on the medial to lateral end of the supraorbital margin and lodges of the lacrimal gland. And on the medial aspect of the orbit, you can see the trochlear fossa, two shallow depressions, yes, on both sides of the nasal cavity, along the orbital surface of each part of the frontal bone. On its corresponding side, each trochlear fossa is located lateral to medial end of a supraorbital margin provided of attachment site of trochlea or a trochlea of the superior oblique muscle of the eye. Some individual trochlear spine may be present instead of the trochlear fossa. Some person has trochlear spine, not trochlear fossa. On the nasal cavity surface or nasal surface of the frontal bone, you can see the most prominent part of it, which call it nasal spine, spina nasalis osis frontalis, pointed anteriorly, projected process found along the midline on the nasal part of frontal bone. It's contribute to the formation of the nasal septum. Yes, contributed to form nasal septum later. Yes, and by sides of it you can see the openings. Yes, here is opening. These two openings of the frontal sinus. Openings of the frontal sinus. Apertura sinus frontalis. They allow communication between the frontal sinuses inside the bone together with the nasal cavity. Also, by sides of the nasal cavity, you can see the upper part, small upper part. Here it is. Yes, of upper border of anterior and posterior ethmoidal foramens, which form later to joining of ethmoidal bone. Yes, that was the frontal bone. Next bone of the neurocranium is sphenoidal bone. Yes, sphenoidal bone. Sphenoidal bone has four parts. First, it is body, large and massive in the midline. Has two wings structure. Paired. First, it is greater wings, ala major osis sphenoidalis, paired for both sides. Lesser wings, ala minor osis sphenoidalis. Yes, and two processes which direct downward from the body and has two lamens. It is pterygoid process of sphenoidal bone. Surfaces of the sphenoidal bone. The body has superior surface, which is present in a sella turcica, posterior surface, anterior surface of sphenoidal bone, inferior surface, superior, inferior, yes, and some small amount of the lateral aspect of body. Again, body has superior, posterior, anterior, inferior, lateral borders and lateral surfaces. The wings has cerebral surface, fascia cerebralis, temporal surface of greater wings, fascias temporalis, fascias infratemporalis, yes, and fascias maxillaris, related with the maxilla. and some visible through the orbit is orbital part or orbital surface of the greater wing. Borders of it is corresponded with the related to this part of the sphenoidal bone, other parts of the skull, such as temporal, frontal, parietal, again frontal, and some aspect of zygomatic, maxillary, the small amount of the intertemporal crest, which separate temporal fossa from infratemporal fossa, etc. The processes, the pterygoid processes of the sphenoidal bone has only two surfaces, which present such as lamins. Yes, this is the medial lamin. This is the lateral lamin, lamina lateralis, lamina medialis of the pterygoid process. And most interesting of this part is structures. Yes, on the superior surface of the body of the sphenoidal bone, you can see the sella turcica, Turkish cella, which has the anterior tuberculum cella on anterior aspect of it, anterior to hypophyseal fossa. This part calls hypophyseal fossa, fossa hypophysealis. And behind of the hypophyseal fossa, you can see the prominent part, which calls dorsum cella, quadrilateral superior projected plane, bony plane found along of the upper aspect of the sphenoidal bone. Yes, and by sides of it, you can see the clinoid process. This is clinoidus posterior. Yes, this is clinoidus posterior. In front of the Turkish cella, you can see groove for the chiasmas, chiasmatic sulcus or sulcus chiasmaticus. Anteriorly to the tuberculum cella and separate from the anterior located sphenoidal yoke by the limbus of sphenoidal bone, as a place of decussation of optic tracts. Behind of the Turkish cella, you can see the clivus of sphenoidal bone, which contains to the clivus of the basilar bone. On the lateral aspect of the sphenoidal bone, you can see the carotid sulcus, consists of the sphenoidal lingula. Yes, sphenoidal lingula, the small part. The place where the carotid artery and cavernous sinus located. Yeah, the carotid artery passed through this foramen, for example, like this. Yes, the carotid artery pass along this sulcus. Yes, next, the lesser wing conjoined with the body and form the canal. This canal called optic canal. That's optic canal, which communicate middle cranial fossa with orbit. The greater wing. On the cerebral surface of the greater wing, you can see the 3 and maybe 4 structures, 4 foramens and 1 notch, which communicate the surface of the greater wing with the other parts of the skull. For example, superior orbital fissure, fissura orbitalis superior, between the lesser wing and greater wing, closer to the body and first, which directed horizontally, call it this one part. Yes, this is the Foramen Rotundum. Yes, the Latin name is same, Foramen Rotundum, closer to the body. Horizontally place it, call it oval foramen, on the end of the greater wing, and near to this you can see the spinous foramen, foramen spinosum, yes, nearly to the oval foramen. And all of these foramens located on both sides of the all wings. Here we can see the groove or notch for the lateral foramen, foramen lacerum. On the anterior surface of the body, you can see the openings for the sphenoidal sinus, apertura sinus sphenoidalis. In the midline of these two or the midline of these two you can see the crest, yes, which prominent forward, yes, which has name as sphenoidal crest, which ends by the rostrum of sphenoidal bone. Yes, by the rostrum of sphenoidal bone. Yes, there is the rostrum of sphenoidal bone. The crest starts from the ethmoidal spine, continues through all anterior surface of the body, ends in the rostrum of sphenoidal bone. As there is rostrum of sphenoidal bone. By sides of this rostrum, we can see the sphenoidal concha, which form the one of the conchas of the nasal cavity. On the inferior surface, same structures such as sphenoidal rostrum, the basis of sphenoidal rostrum, and by sides of it, the vaginal process of the sphenoidal bone, which related anteriorly with the sphenoidal process of palatine bone and posteriorly with the superior border of vomer, and contributed to formation of the sphenovomeral suture. And also this crest and rostrum form the nasal septum later. Okay, and what else on it? Posterior aspect of the pterygoid process has, on the basis of it, has sulcus auditori, sulcus tube auditive, sulcus tube auditive, yes, which arise from the spine of sphenoidal bone, yes, which relate with the temporal bone on this side, and is the groove for the auditory tube or eustachian tube. Below of it, you can see the pterygoid tubercle of sphenoidal bone, which continues to the vaginal process, and also below of it, this structure, scaphoid fossa of sphenoidal bone, scaphoidal fossa of sphenoidal fossa scaphoidea of the sphenoidal bone is the shallow depression in between these two lamens, which contribute from the pterygoid tubercle to the lamens and is the place of origin of tensor valley palatini. Next, between the two lamens of the pterygoid process, you can see pterygoid fossa between the two lamens, lateral and medial. And on the lateral on the lateral one, you can see the pterygospinous process of pterygospinosus. Yes. And on the inferior aspect of the medial lamen, you can see the pterygoid hamulus of the sphenoidal bone, pterygoid hook. Yes, pterygoid hook of the pterygoid process of the sphenoidal bone. All of these structures, most of them, of the pterygoid process is the place of origin of muscles of the palate and muscles of mastication, some of muscles of mastication. Yes, and on the basis of the pterygoid process between the body and process, you can see the canal. That's this canal. We call it pterygoid canal. That's this one, pterygoid canal. Canalis pterygoideus. Yes, canalis pterygoideus, or Vidian canal, tuberal passage found on each side of the body, or basis of the pterygoid processes between the body and processes, and it extends anteriorly from its posterior opening, which is found along of the foramen lacerum, to its anterior opening, which is found of pterygoid fossa. The pterygoid canal allows for the passage of the arteries, veins, and some nerves, which you will learn later. That was the sphenoidal bone. And last bone of this topic is ethmoidal bone. Ethmoidal bone. Here's the ethmoidal bone. Firstly, we should find it on the skull. The ethmoidal bone located on the medial aspect of the orbit. Yes, and form the medial wall of the orbit. Yes, is also located in the top of the nasal cavity and has several parts. First, it consists of the ethmoidal labyrinth. Yes, it consists of the ethmoidal labyrinth. Consists of ethmoidal labyrinth. Yes, consists also from the perpendicular plate and horizontal plate. Perpendicular plate or horizontal plate. And horizontal plate. Perpendicular plate and horizontal plate. On the horizontal plate, you can find the cribriform plate and crista galli. Yes. And also some parts of the foramens which we mentioned before. There's the anterior and posterior ethmoidal foramens. Surfaces of ethmoidal bone. Ethmoidal bone has anterior border, has inferior border, which is part of the nasal septum, lateral surface of the nasal septum, or lateral surface of perpendicular plate, facies lateralis lamina perpendicularis, orbital surface of ethmoidal bone, and posterior border of the perpendicular plate, which relate with sphenoidal bone. Yes, and landmarks or structures. First, ala of crista galli. Yes, the wings of wing-like structure which project that frontal anterior aspect of the crista galli of ethmoidal bone. They form a posterior margin of the foramen cecum. Yes, it forms the foramen cecum smaller. As you see it's bifurcated, and can form the foramen cecum. Anterior ethmoidal groove, sulcus ethmoidalis, ossis ethmoidalis, sulcus ethmoidalis, or anterior ethmoidal groove. Yes, posteriorly for it, you can see posterior ethmoidal groove, anterior and posterior. This groove located between the two cellulas. Also, after communication with the frontal bone, it formed the ethmoidal foramens. Yes, the some vessels and nerves pass through these grooves and foramens. Next, it is superior nasal concha. Superior nasal concha form the one of the metastases of the nasal cavity. Superior nasal concha. Yes, for both sides. Yes, you see it. There's superior nasal concha. Yes, next one is uxinate process. Yes, uxinate process or hook-like structure, curved, projected found along the inferior lateral aspect of each side. Yes, and with the ethmoidal process of inferior nasal concha. Yes, to form the medial nasal wall, and also medial nasal concha. Then, ethmoidal bone has superior nasal concha, yes, and inferior nasal concha. Superior nasal concha, medial nasal concha, and some relationship with inferior nasal concha, such as uxinate process. Yes, that's all about the ethmoidal bone, and also the body, or more the large amount of the cellula of the ethmoidal bone is hollow and filled by the air, and largest cell of the ethmoidal bone, call it as bulla ethmoidalis. That's all what you have to know about the visceral, about the neurocranium.